Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Good morning or evening for those in different time zones. Welcome to this session on effective alternatives to social auditing, which is being hosted as part of the OECD Due Diligence Forum on the garment and footwear sector. I know there are still some people joining, so we'll give it a couple of minutes. Okay, so my name is Grace Camera, and I'm the Senior Legal Advisor and Garment and Apparel Sector Lead at Business and Human Rights Compliance, which is the Business and Human Rights Division of Global Rights Compliance. Global Rights Compliance is an international human rights law and development firm based in The Hague, and our business and human rights team provides advisory services to businesses, trade associations, and investors on the legal and practical dimensions of human rights due diligence. We actively support organizations in developing responsible business models that prioritize human rights, minimize legal risks, and foster sustainable practices. We're delighted that you can join us for this side session this afternoon, and we'll begin with a round of introductions from our speakers, and then I'll briefly set the stage and provide some background on the challenges presented by traditional social auditing approaches. I'll then invite our speakers to give their perspective and provide some recommendations on how the sector can move towards more effective social auditing practices. Okay, so perhaps we could start with Sarosh. Would you like to introduce yourself first?
Hi everyone. I'm Sarosh Kuruvilla. I am a professor at Cornell University, where I co-head the ILR Global Labor Institute for the study of labor practices in supply chains, and we tend to focus on doing empirical research on labor practices.
Great, thank you, Sarosh. Jayant, do you want to go next?
Thanks, Grace. Hello, everyone. My name is Jayant Kashyap Balasubramanian. That's a mouthful, but I'm the investment lead for the Good Fashion Fund based in the Netherlands. The Good Fashion Fund is a demonstration fund, $19 million that was established in 2019 with one objective: to showcase the business and impact case of directly investing in suppliers based in the global south. We currently have a portfolio of 4 companies, 2 in India, 2 in Bangladesh. Probably do a couple more this year and have aspirations for a larger fund. So quite excited to share our experience in terms of how we work with the factory, specifically on the environmental side, but equally on the social side and to an extent on the governance as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jayant. Laurent, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. Good morning, afternoon, good evening, everyone. So my name is Laurent Arnon. I am the sector lead for apparel and textile at Ethical Trading Initiative. So the Ethical Trading Initiative is an alliance of NGOs, companies, and trade unions working together to advance workers' rights in global supply chains. What we do is mainly based on human rights due diligence and how to implement human rights due diligence to drive better progress for workers. Delighted to be here this afternoon and to exchange with you all.
Great, thank you, Laurent. Sahel, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Grace. Hi, everyone. So I'm Sakib Sohail. I lead the responsible business team at Artistic Milliners. Artistic Milliners is one of the biggest suppliers and manufacturers of denim produce, including fabric and garments. We are vertically integrated. And in my role, I'm leading the ESG teams as well as the CSR teams. And we also look after 2 big cotton projects that we run. So it's a lot of fun stuff, interesting stuff, and looking forward to sharing my point of view with everyone.
Thank you so much. And finally, Lara.
Thanks, Grace. And hello, everybody. My name is Lara Strangways. I head the Business and Human Rights Division of Global Rights Compliance, Business and Human Rights Compliance. As Grace mentioned, we provide advisory services to businesses, trade associations, and investors on the legal and practical dimensions of human rights due diligence. We particularly specialize in on-the-ground approaches that place stakeholder engagement as central throughout the due diligence process. So really looking forward to this conversation today, and thank you all for joining us.
Great, thank you, Laura. Okay, so as mentioned, I think it's helpful to set a little bit of the scene and to really understand, the main purpose of today's session. Over the last few years, there have been numerous conversations about the inadequacy of social audits in the garment and apparel sector. A 2022 report by Human Rights Watch on social auditing, titled "Obsessed with Audit Tools, Missing the Goal," highlights some of these inadequacies. So, for example, the report states that social audit and certification processes are riddled with conflicts of interest and loopholes and other problems that render the processes inadequate tools for respecting human rights and environmental standards. So really the purpose of today's session is to move the conversation on from discussing the limitations of social auditing to exploring more effective and innovative approaches, including community-based auditing. So I'm sure that you'll have lots of questions as the session proceeds. We'd ask you to post your questions and comments using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And please include your name, job title, and organization or affiliation. And then we'll pose those questions to our speakers once they've concluded their presentations. Okay, so I think we'll get going. We'll start with Sarosh, who's going to give us a really helpful presentation on his research findings, looking at traditional social auditing practices and how they've evolved over time. Over to you, Sarosh.
Yeah, can we have slide one? Next slide. Yeah, so, this is decades of research about auditing has highlighted three problems. One is poorly trained auditors. There's no formal training process. Being an HR person allows you to be an expert on payroll, but that doesn't make you an expert on structural safety of buildings. And there's a question of, whether using auditing firms versus companies doing their own auditing with in-house auditors is better. So one of the problems is generally poorly trained auditors. The second problem is the average duration of an audit is very small. It's about typically 1 or 2 person days, right? And that's important because more than the typical audit auditor needs to check about somewhere between 500 and 600 items on the code of conduct, and so if there are so many items, how much can be accomplished in a 1 person or 2 person day audit in a large factory? The third issue is the cost of an audit and who pays the auditor. Although there's variation across countries, the costs of an audit are relatively small. And there's an increasing trend that suppliers pay the audit rather than the brands, which sets up, the ideal conditions for collusion. Next slide. So this is a quick table which kind of looks at 2 big factories in China, one with 3,000 workers, the other one with 2,000 workers, and you can sort of see the average time in the number of man days, and you can see the cost where the audit was done by a third-party auditor. And, we're looking at $1,700 on average for factory A and $1,500 for factory B. In other countries, the cost is even cheaper. Next slide. This is from my book. This is data from an auditing firm, and the auditing firm has sort of basically told us about the information given to the auditing firm. The auditing firm determines whether the information given is reliable or falsified. And as you can sort of see here from this data, China and India, 50% of some of the audits in this sample were classified as falsified and inconclusive. Next slide. This is the same data, but across multiple industries, and you can sort of see that the toys is the highest with more than 60% of falsification from this sample. Next slide. Then we studied audit consultant services. This is a big, fairly big industry in China. We can follow their websites. And this is an advertisement from one of those services that kind of shows you that this is what they advertise. Payroll and attendance records can be automatically generated in hundreds of inspection system documentation, 90 seconds, one-click generation. So this is testament to the fact that, routinely these consulting companies help factories falsify audit data. Next slide. This is actually, we followed a work pattern of an audit consultant firm. This person helps the company in phase one, helps the factory generate falsified documents. Then they train workers to sort of say whatever the auditors would like to hear. They determine the place for an audit. Sometimes they even hide or borrow a factory, and they have extensive connections with the audit people in China, so they can even know and tell the factory, oh well, if it's Disney, we know exactly which auditor will be coming. And so I will leave you to look at phase two at your own time, but this is described extensively in my book, which you can find easily on the web. Next slide. So basically, the summary, of all of this research over the last 15, 20 years is it has become a low-cost, commoditized activity. There is a fair amount of audit fraud. And because the costs are so low, auditors tend to do a tick-in-the-box exercise. They go in, they check. Some items are very difficult to uncover in audits, whether there's gender-based violence or sexual harassment, whether there's suppression of freedom of association. In a 2-day audit where you do a number of things and one person doing a number of things, it's very hard to get people to talk freely. So that's something. And then the biggest problem is that, perhaps a big problem, is that social auditing does not study the effect of company purchasing practices on working conditions. And we know that, one cause of lousy working conditions in factories and violations are due to poor purchasing practices. But auditing thus far doesn't look at that because that's not what it is designed to do. Okay, next slide. So, okay, so now, we're talking about due diligence legislation. Is this really a new dawn? And all of you are aware of all the different legislation, so I'm not going to sort of belabor that point. But the point is that conducting due diligence to analyze risks in the supply chain has just become a much more involved operation for companies, more rigorous operation. And it's a heavy lift, because until now they could always, ask the auditors to do the work, but now they have to really be involved to ensure that they are conducting good risk analysis. And there is, significant consequences: civil liability, administrative fines, and, for CSRD in France, fines and imprisonment, and so on and so forth. So companies will clearly need to increase the quality of their intelligence and information about supply chains. Last slide. So one of the issues is to, do we improve auditing, which means longer duration, better training, higher costs. So that's one pathway going forward. Can auditing be improved? The second thing that might influence audit is auditor liability. If civil liability for companies, can auditors also be liable for the work that they do? And if they do a lousy job, can we sue them? So that's also a possibility. There are suits against audit firms at the moment. Then also with that is audit transparency. Can we make sure that we know who did the audit? Because that's crucial for liability purposes. The third issue is, maybe there are alternatives. Can we have the local workers in the factory effectively do the audit? Can the local labor union or the community, I'm sure we're going to talk more about that, be effective auditors? And finally, you can't look at auditing in a vacuum. You have to look at the sourcing strategies. So is there supply chain consolidation, moving to partnership models, and better purchasing practices that reduce the need for the kind of auditing and the lack of trust that we see today? So these are all, I'm sure that my colleagues on the panel will be talking about many of these. Last slide. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Sarosh. Well, hopefully you're not done, because we want to hear much more from you, of course, on some of the issues that you raised, and I'm sure that we have so many questions around some of the issues that you've discussed. So thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to hand over now to Jayant, who's from the Good Fashion Fund, and hopefully can give us the investor perspective on this issue. Over to you, Jayant.
Thanks, Grace, and thanks, Sarosh. I think really, really good data points there. I decided to go against the presentation and have a discussion, just to maybe keep it a bit more interesting. And maybe before I talk about, in terms of alternatives, recap in terms of what the Good Fashion Fund does for anyone who's joined a little bit late. So we are an impact investment fund, probably the only impact investment fund that's operating within the textile and apparel industry, currently focused on 2 countries, India and Bangladesh, arguably two of the biggest contributors in terms of export markets to North America, to Europe, and to other parts of the world as well. So typically what the Good Fashion Fund does is we provide long-term dollar-based finance for manufacturers to invest in really impactful or sustainable production technologies within the factory. By doing that, we hope that we will be able to achieve a significant reduction in either consumption of energy or water or materials in which it could be hazardous chemicals and or waste. Now, of course, because we're an investor, our sphere of influence is a bit, let's say, narrower compared to brands, and maybe a bit more broader compared to a regular stakeholder that might be working in suppliers. So what we do in terms of our engagement model is part of the legal documentation, loan documentation, the factory commits to an environmental and social action plan. Of course, as an investor, our assessments are not exactly pure play audits that brands might do, but we work with an independent multi-stakeholder partnership organization called the Fair Wear Foundation, and we've essentially adopted their approach. We've included them in our own investment process. Of course, I think some interesting facts that they do spend 2 days at the factory, but I think the interesting point to their approach, and which we've also appreciated, is besides speaking to the workers and to the staff within the factory, they also spend time doing an unannounced offline audit where they also speak to the community, the families, and maybe the communities that live around the factory, to get a holistic sense in terms of what the real situation is on ground. Now, the outcome of this assessment is transferred into the environmental and social action plan. The environmental aspects comes from the verification of, let's say, the HIG FEM, the Facility Environment Module, and together we have an action plan that's completely internal to us as the investor and to the factory. But what are we doing beyond that? Of course, you do have your regular points in terms of improvements related to occupational health and safety, but then there are more systemic issues. Like a great point which Sarosh talked about was root cause in terms of poor purchasing practices also leading to these violations. That's what we would like to get to. So what happens is, after we've made the investment, we also engage individual ENS consultants for a longer term, maybe initially 6 months and then to 12 months, and work on very specific issues, really get down to the root cause of that particular issue. And then at our own cost, we don't have a technical assistance facility, is to really see in terms of what we could do to move them from, let's say, non-compliance to compliance, and then towards progressive action items. Of course, in our case, we've also been lucky to work with entrepreneurs who are also thinking in that progressive mindset, or they see that these regulations are just around the corner and they want to become future ready. So these companies and suppliers want to be ready for the future, but at the same time, they also want to work with an investor like us to make these implementations already. So that's our general approach. I guess in terms of what we're already doing a bit differently from the traditional market is that we notice a lot of social audit fatigue. I think there's a topic from another side session somewhere else, but I think we keep hearing about this, and of course we have a manufacturer on the panel who will probably talk about this. What we've done is we've taken existing caps or existing action plans, existing social audit reports. These could be from SEDEX, or it could be from FSLM or the SELP, or any other equivalent reports that are out there, and we layer it on top of the report ourselves. What this does for us is we can do a modular assessment, really focus on the aspects that are valuable for us, and not reinvent the wheel every single time we visit the factory or assess the factory. I think harmonizing these kind of audits are also quite important, and that's where we are getting to as an investor. And I think I spoke about long-term improvements in terms of ENS, and the partnership-based approach that we have with Fair Wear Foundation, for example, and and particularly with the local experts or ENS consultants who've been traditionally working in these sectors. If you take spinning as an industry down south, you traditionally have seen a lot of violations happening in terms of forced labor, or in some instances, child labor also. So we work with people who are really understanding of the contextual situation and then come up with a feasible solution cost-wise. Because once again, I think important point and full disclosure is our assessments are also paid by the factory. But to avoid this conflict of interest, what happens is we ask the factory to essentially pay the cost of audit to us, so that then we can reimburse to the service provider, so that there's no collusion happening on the site. And that's maybe just one solution in terms of how we can reduce conflict of interest. But largely, I think what we think, of course, there aren't too many investors also. If you really think about it, if brands desire to open up their balance sheets, I think, and just spend maybe, let's say, 0.5 or 0.2% of their existing capital on organizing their own supply chain. Of course, I'm not bashing these brands. It's just that you need very little capital, and that goes a long way in terms of working with these manufacturers. I think today the reality is, with so many regulations around the corner, so many changes happening, you have a macroeconomic situation that's not doing well. You have procurement teams fighting cents to the dollar. So you really need to find ways to come together to support the supplier and to de-risk them from, let's say, technology risks or ENS-related risks or market risks. And that requires collaboration from investors, from brands, from academia, from other experts as well. And for us, of course, this is a small fund. We've only made 4 investments, probably do maybe 3 more. We do have aspirations for a larger fund, but that is, after all, just a drop in the ocean, and we only hope to demonstrate that this kind of a model is scalable with the right incentives for the manufacturers. I think that's really where we come in as an investor. Of course, we do a lot more. We will be coming out with a publication in Q1 still, which encapsulates our lessons learned as an investor working in the space for the last 5 years, and what we've learned, and our own trials and tribulations that we've seen by working with our manufacturer partners in these 2 countries. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that contribution, Jayant. I'm sure, well, we see a lot of questions in the chat and comments, so I'm sure that we're wanting to hear a bit more as an investor how you're really helping to shape the sector. So thank you for that. Okay, so now handing over to Laurent from the Ethical Trading Initiative. Laurent, please.
Sure. Thank you, Grace. Just maybe a few words about the Ethical Trading Initiative for those who don't know us. As I mentioned, we're working with NGOs, trade unions, and company members who are members of the Ethical Trading Initiative. And what we do is we try to influence them to act responsibly and promote decent work in their supply chain, following the ETI-based code and the UNGPs. So how we do that, we bring stakeholders together, stakeholders meaning all members, but as well external stakeholders, and we try through the membership to reach, I would say we have a reach of about 15 million workers through the 120 members that are part of the Ethical Trading Initiative, mainly in apparel and textile supply chain, food, farming, fisheries, and as well in general merchandise. And our approach is mainly based, or is probably, it's fair to say, very centered around human rights due diligence and trying to go beyond compliance. So we demand businesses to find out about the risks within their supply chain and to look at prioritizing them, mitigating, and reporting on those risks through an inclusive due diligence approach. So auditing is, as part of the way we do due diligence, is one of those tools that need or that are actually being used. And our view is that well-run, high-quality audits can be a useful tool, and they have a role to play in the approach that brands and suppliers can take in terms of doing their human rights due diligence. Of course, there are limitations to those that have been highlighted already, that provide just a snapshot at one time, that don't provide much of the context or sometimes the necessary context to really understand some of the issues and address the root causes of the issues that are being identified. I think our main point when we talk to brands and to retailers is that audits should be one tool as part of a series of other tools to do their human rights due diligence. So if you look at a human rights due diligence toolbox, it should have other, I would say, aspects and should be complemented by other tools than just audits. So we can, of course, acknowledge the limitations of audits. I think some of them have been highlighted, but more generally, we know that issues related to gender-based violence and harassment, for example, forced labor or child labor sometimes fall under the radar of, I would say, traditional audits. In the case of gender-based violence and harassment, they are generally underreported through existing grievance mechanisms. But at the same time, if an audit includes consultation with workers, it's not likely to be picked up either. It's not likely that a woman that has been harassed or a victim of sexual violations will convey that or share that with an auditor that is doing interviews within the premises of a factory. Similarly, other violation of workers' rights are sometimes difficult to be actually picked up by audits. I think as well that lately we can probably agree that over the last couple of years, we've seen a number of crises. So there may be weather disasters, natural disasters, conflicts, economic crisis, unrest, which create a context where the use of audits itself is very difficult, sometimes dangerous, and sometimes absolutely impossible to convey. So it's important to be aware of those limitations and that put into, I would say, context that the use of audits can be useful, but they need to be complemented by other approaches. So how to mitigate, I think, those limitations? I think that probably there are two ways of looking at that. The first one is how to improve audits and the way they are used. And Sarosh mentioned the lack of training, for example, sometimes the gaps in terms of trainings. So I think improving the way audits are conducted can help provide better quality audits through training, guidance for auditors, but as well for companies. For example, ETI has developed resources for auditors and companies around the assessment of freedom of association. And this includes indicators, evidence, the type of information that needs to be collected, as well as questions that need to be asked and how to interpret the answers to those questions. Besides that, I think there's also an importance in terms of how brands and retailers will look at audits and interpret them. If we look at the results of an audit, I think it's important to consider that those results need to be scrutinized a little bit more and understand that there may be sometimes oversights or a lack of time as wanted to identify the real issues. So for example, where specific problems are known to be endemic in the sector or in a specific region, a clean audit is probably a sign that it's been incorrectly done or where there may be some challenges or where the results can actually be challenged. I think besides the kind of like the improvement or actual audit, there's the combination of actual audit with real stakeholder engagement within the supply chain and the implementation of a human rights due diligence approach that is inclusive and based on a series of different tools. One of the key elements for ETI and in our perspective is to engage with the workers and their representatives directly to understand what labor rights issues are common in a specific country or in a specific region or in a specific, say, setting. Empower as well the workers to raise their voice and their concerns and advocate for their rights by promoting worker representation and freedom of association, where workers are represented and we have effective mechanisms for worker representation. We usually see the number of non-compliance reducing because workers are empowered to discuss those issues and resolve those issues with management. So it helps as well reduce maybe the need for actually auditing those type of context and to a certain extent at least. I think there's also a need to engage, and that's probably something we really want to stress, is to better engage with their suppliers to build long-term relationship and build the capacity and develop the management systems that support better outcome for workers. And I wanted to give an example of one of our company members, Lindex, who integrated gender equality into their supplier management system. So they launched a toolbox for their suppliers to measure the gender performance of the business operations. That means that Lindex also works with their suppliers towards better, I would say, integration of gender action plans more specifically. And the process is based on supplier self-assessment, but also an open dialogue with Lindex and between Lindex and their suppliers. So I think there are also opportunities to look at ways of collaborating better with suppliers through an open discussion. And lastly, I wanted to give some insight we're seeing as well from other sectors. I think over the last couple of years, we've seen examples of good practice with the inclusion of human rights impact assessment as part of the human rights due diligence toolkits. So these tools help us move from a compliance-based discussion to a dialogue really centered around workers and their rights. So if we look at the role of this type of human rights impact assessment, they're really looking at measuring the gap between the human rights in principle and the human rights in reality. So what is observed on the ground. They identify the main issues and the main impacts that corporate activities might have, and include recommendations that look at preventing and mitigating the impact identified. So I think the most important part of those assessments is that they are based on an ongoing and meaningful engagement with stakeholders, local labor rights organizations, civil society, and they identify the impact and determine approaches or the best approaches that would help prevent and mitigate them. So it's really around this kind of like stakeholder engagement and meaningful understanding of the contextualized issues and how to address them. So I think those type of examples have been seen more specifically or more generally in food farming and in like agricultural type of setting. But we don't need to reinvent the wheel if we see those elements bringing some value and helping to drive progress. So I think there's some inspiration we can take as well from other sectors to look at the alternatives or the complementary role that other tools can have besides audits. So maybe just in summary, I think that audits have some value as part of the HRDD toolbox, but we need to acknowledge their limitations. That means that it's possible to improve audits through better training and to better understanding of how to interpret them. There's also an opportunity to combine audits with other tools and to really look at how to engage meaningfully the different stakeholders to gather the right information, prioritizing the risks, and really looking at the specific risks within a supply chain based on this type of information. I think that's part of like the type of message we really try to convey to brands and our different stakeholders. And I'll stop here.
Great, thank you so much, Laurent. It's especially helpful to include the gender perspective as well. I think that's very helpful and often one that's overlooked, but as we know that within the garment sector, it does disproportionately affect women. So very important to raise that point. Okay, just in the interest of time, we are sort of moving on quite quickly. So I'll now hand over to Saqib. Saqib, if you could keep to the 5 minutes if possible. I know you have a presentation, and then we'll finish up with Laura. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. All right, if you can just put up the presentation, and all right, next slide. So for the people who are joining in, I'm Saqib Suhail. I work with Artistic Millionaires, and we are a big organization with huge capacity in terms of making fabric and garments, which means we have a lot of responsibility as well. Moving on, next slide. So I would just like all of you to take a look at this picture, right? And this is just one slide. I can fill up 2-3 slides like that easily. And some of them are partners, some of them are treaties, some of them are audits, and all of this adds up. And I'll show you in the next few slides how it adds up and how it takes us away from the focus that we need to have in our organizations. Moving on, please. Next slide. So to begin with, and I saw pretty good numbers from Sarosh, and I got some nice feedback from Giant and Laurent as well. And I think pretty much everyone is on the same page when we say that, you know, audits lose their value and there's too much going on. And to start off with, you know, there's too much audit fatigue. Just to give you an example, at Artistic Millionaires, we face at least 100 man days of audits per year. That's like when the auditors come in. That does not count the amount of preparation it takes to take care of these 100 days. So on the back of that, the teams are working for like 200 man days, 300 man days, and working on. That's like a big burden. That's like a big cost. Second is our reporting burden. as Saru said, and Jan has also mentioned, everyone would love to reduce that burden as much as possible. But at the moment, what we see is we have a couple of good examples in SLCP and Better Work. But again, there are not many players who have, come on board with that. We still have, like at Artistic Milliners, we are working with like more than 50, 60 customers. Not all of them are following the same portal. Not all of them following the same platform. Not all of them have the same COCs. But that puts a lot of burden for us in understanding what needs to be done. And most of the time, the result is the same, but the way you reach that result is different, right? The methodology of everyone is different. And that makes to implement all of that a little bit harder. The cost of audit, even though the cost of auditors is going low, but what is costing us? I'm just giving an example. It costs us more than $150,000 per year to take care of the audits. And then the certification costs are separate. So imagine doing all of that. And, when I was discussing this with my team and with you guys as well, one question keeps popping up in my mind. Why are we so much worried about social audits, right? And the reason is we want to improve the life of the people who are making product for us. So we're thinking, is there any other way to get this done? How can we improve their lives and really focus, put our money where the problem is? So I'll show you that in the next few slides as well. But before I move forward, I'll give you a couple of blind spots that we have. So everyone is focused on the garment side of the industry. There's a lot of due diligence coming in at the fabric mills as well. But upstream, when you go towards the ginners, when you go towards the other producers and traders, brokers, and to the farm side, there's not enough due diligence over there. And with all the laws that Saroj talked about and everyone else, I don't see these partners in the supply chain being involved at all in the next 4 or 5 years, which means these are one of the most marginalized people in the supply chain, and still they have not been catered for. So, and for a manufacturer, it's very easy to just let them be. If I'm just following the due diligence laws and the regulations, I would not care about these people until the law is there. But that's not the right way of doing things. So I'll explain about that a little bit later. But last point about the audit and complaint mechanism. And I'm looking forward to what Lara has to say about their work in Pakistan. But what we have seen is so difficult to distinguish between the genuine complaints and the disgruntled worker. I might be not happy with my boss today. I might just pick up a phone and, email someone and say, Artistic Milliners or anyone else, A, B, and C is not doing a good job. You should go and do something about it. That's a complaint raised, right? But is it genuine? Does that help my colleagues are working around me? So the mechanism in which these complaints are dealt with, it has to be more thought. It has to be more focused, and it has to lead to a result. Next slide, please. So what we have thought of, I'm just not going to come and say, oh, everything is bad and we are the victims, but I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how partnerships also help. The next slide, please. So in the earlier slide, I also gave you example of how Better Work has come in, even though it's not scaled to all our customers, but what we are seeing is the result on the ground level is very encouraging. We have seen good programs being done at the ground level. The workers are giving honest feedback. We are also getting good feedback that will help us in improving the social conditions of the employees. So that is one good program. We have been working with Fair Trade for some time now. That has been directly affecting the welfare of the people. I believe that is a good alternate as well of always auditing. Digital-based systems, grievance systems. So not only our own grievance system, but we are also involved with our brand partners who have their own direct lines. Again, as I said, it's like I'm on the fence on this part that how many genuine grievances really go, but still there is an understanding, and I think this is where Lauren comes in, and they tell the brands and customers that you cannot just treat every complaint as like a red flag. You have to engage with your supply chain and understand the context as well. Because one thing is very important is contextualizing. So if you cannot contextualize what's happening, then you will always end up in the wrong place. So that is one of the things. So the expectations that we have, and then believe there's a lot of trust deficit between the supply chain, different actors of supply chain, but that cannot be reduced by added audits, right? It has to be reduced through mutual trust, through more engagement, through more programs in which both parties feel that they are working for the betterment of the people who are making our products. So if you don't have that feel, then audits will continue to grow, auditing firms will continue to grow, the mandates will increase, but at the end of the day, what we are working for, we will not be able to achieve. So yeah, this is Grace put me on a strict timer, so I'm not gonna go on further than that, and hope there are some interesting questions coming in.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, unfortunately, the time has gone very quickly, but that was very, very helpful to have the supplier perspective. And I think you raised some really interesting points there that hopefully we can return to in the Q&A. Okay, over to Lara. Lara, again, if you could keep to the 5 minutes, that would be great. And then we can move on to the Q&A session. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think I have some slides if they could be put up. But hello, everyone. As I mentioned earlier, Lara Strangways here from Business and Human Rights Compliance. So as I said in the introduction I gave at the beginning of this session, we really pride ourselves on helping businesses, trade associations, and investors with a specialism and on-the-ground approaches that place stakeholder engagement at the center of due diligence processes. I think it's widely acknowledged that in order to have effective and safe engagement with affected rights holders, including workers, we need to be engaging the workers in this process, and that really will allow human-centric, worker-driven due diligence in the way that I think everyone is intending. And that really builds on Surash's point earlier. How do we look at alternative approaches to auditing that really bring in the community and the communities that are working for example, these factories that are producing garments? So to address this particular issue, Business and Human Rights Compliance has been collaborating with civil society organizations and also trade unions to identify alternative approaches that identify complaints, but they also bolster efforts to address how labor rights complaints are addressed, either through informal or formal remediation channels. And that's always the kind of missing bit at the end that we can also talk to a bit later on. But I'm just going to use our time together to talk about our flagship project in Pakistan that's been running since 2022. And that focuses on the use of community-based monitoring through paralegals and legal aid centers across 3 main industrial hubs in Pakistan. If I can have the next slide, please. In Lahore, Faisalabad, and Karachi. So when we started this program, it was a pilot. We were not clear on how successful this approach would be. However, we've had the legal aid centers set up since July of 2023. So in the first 6 months of the program, i.e. until last month, we have had 1,286 workers visit the centres, linking to more than 2,585 labour rights violations. So broadly, it's been successful. We're having a lot of engagement with workers, and picking up on Sakib's point, it's, the complaints have to be sorted, but we are getting a lot of information. So I want to talk through the 3 component parts of this programme. Firstly, trusted paralegals. Secondly, data gathering through technology. And thirdly, engagement with international garment brands. So to the first point, trusted paralegals, it was important to us that this program didn't create a system that sat outside of the community, but instead we identify entry points to the ecosystem that already exists in the communities that service the garment factories. There are many people that are doing this work day in, day out. There are trade unionists, labour rights activists, and just community leaders who, on an ad hoc basis, are collecting complaints and have been doing so for decades. And we really wanted to centralise them to the programme. So we started by working with local partners to identify who these people were. and essentially figure out who is kind of talking to the communities that service those 3 industrial hubs. On to the next slide, please. We recruited these individuals as paralegals and provided them with a very high standard of human rights investigations training. And that is a specialism of global rights compliance to ensure that all complaints are collected in a trauma-informed and gender-sensitive way to ensure that the information is correct. And they have been hired to sit within the community 5 days a week and speak to workers. Next slide. So secondly, we sought to address the issue of coordination, another tech solution I know, but one of the things that came out with our conversations with brands was that complaints were often brought to them in an ad hoc way by workers, civil society, organizations, trade unions, but nobody, for example, in Pakistan could point to a holistic data source for the country and what the types of complaints that were coming up were. So we equipped the paralegals with an app. This was built in-house by Business and Human Rights Compliance called MyVox. And essentially it provides a centralized point where all the data gathered can be seen, and we can start to build a picture of the trends and the types of complaints that are arising through the centers. So, for example, we were able to identify from the initial data that 20% of all cases that we are receiving are on wage violations. So that encompasses issues such as underpayment, unpaid overtime, piece rate discrepancies, and other complaints kind of lodged in the app are absence of contracts, lack of social security registration, and grievances pertaining to freedom of association, to name a few. But this essentially provides a centralized repository for all that data. And we have ensured that our data correlates with other initiatives that brands rely on to gather data. For example, Open Supply Hub, who is a partner of ours, and we ensure that our data is integrated with them. So that leads me finally to the third point, which is brand engagement. If you could go to the next slide, please. By having this kind of centralized data source that is almost live monitoring of the situation on the ground, we've been able to identify that 215 factories have been linked with these complaints, and that implicates almost 240 international garment brands. So in December, we hosted the first of what will be a series of roundtables with international garment brands named in these complaints, not to name and shame, but to talk about a solutions-based approach, i.e. if we are seeing that the 5-10 brands are sourcing out of the same factories that are experiencing piece rate wage violations, then what can be done as a group to address this? So that kind of brings me to the end of my presentation, but I want to just quickly say that we do have plans to expand this program to other buying locations such as Turkey. So if you do have any questions about this program or the data that's been presented in this quick 5 minutes, do reach out. The team are very friendly and we would be more than happy to have a conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lara, for that. We are almost at the end of the session, so we're going to have time, I think, to take 1 or 2 questions. We've had quite a few questions posted in the chat, and thank you to our speakers for answering those. But I thought it's still helpful to highlight some of those questions, and perhaps you could share your answers with the group. So the first one, this was actually for Sarosh, but please, other speakers, feel free to weigh in, is someone has asked, so in order to really address some of the hidden risks that are often apparent in these different contexts and regions, you really need to have a local expert that understands the unique situations that are arising. So how can we ensure that happens? And this question was directed to Sarosh, but as I said, please, other speakers, feel free to weigh in as well. Sarosh, would you like to go first?
So I think I completely agree. The need for local experts who know the community well and the context, and I think that's exactly what Lara Strangways was talking about when she talked about people in the local community who do it. And I think it's a really important for maybe there are other community members, city mayors, village officials, local labor unions, local community groups. One of the big problems is that they need access to the factory and that would be good, because but it is possible. I think that it's much better than jetting in an auditor from outside who doesn't know any context, who can't talk to workers in their homes, things like that. I agree with the question.
Anyone else have any reflections on that? Maybe Laurent, I don't know if you can maybe perhaps give the brand perspective on that. So obviously brands a little bit more removed from the local operations oftentimes.
Thanks, Grace. Sorry, trying to unmute. Yes, I think the work and the work with local organization is absolutely essential in terms of driving and understanding kind of like what the contextualized issues that companies or workers are facing. One element, I just came back from a trip to India where we met lots of like stakeholders, but also civil society organizations that are actually living and breathing the issues of workers in the context, and trying to find ways to empower as well the use of the information, the insights that those local organizations can drive and help convey to inform a better due diligence approach and a better assessment of the risks to worker is essential. Probably there are some I would say limitation or like challenges to do that, to empower them, to give them the right tools to do it, to give them the right capacity building to raise this information. But absolutely essential to be able to kind of convey. It seems that the tool that Lara mentioned is something very interesting to look at, how we can kind of like drive this and provide the tools for local communities to be able to input in a wider, I would say, kind of like due diligence approach.
And maybe Saqib, as you're on the ground, I don't know if you have a view on sort of being able to commission local experts and maybe some of the challenges around that.
Yeah, I agree with what Lauren is saying, and I think it's not a choice. I think it should be mandatory. You cannot just parachute in and try to understand the local context. It's like learning on the job, and by the time you learn, you probably have messed up something. So it's important for someone with a local context to understand. Sometimes we have seen a lot of, even within our own country, we have so many different people from different backgrounds who come in, and it's important to understand the context from their point of view, because otherwise things can just get bubblegum. It will just keep on elongating and you won't find a solution. But as soon as you understand the context where the person is coming from, culturally, religiously, or the sensitivities that they have, then you can solve the problem. So from people who are coming in without any background knowledge of how people operate in that area, it will just add on and pile on to the problem rather than solving it.
Okay, thank you for that. We have another question on brand engagement. This one has been directed to Lara. So besides collective brand engagements, have you made any interventions targeting specific cases in specific companies? What kind of approaches do you take?
Yes, so as part of the larger brand engagement, we were also doing specific brand engagement with those brands that were kind of named through the complaints and looking at what their kind of procedures are for investigating the complaints. So we are in conversation with a number of international garment brands who are now, as a direct result of the complaints that have been lodged through this program, undergoing investigations in country into whether kind of what the evidence is, and speaking with worker representatives to ensure that those cases are followed up on. And I just want to take this opportunity to actually say, in terms of following up on complaints, because I see a question in the chat about that. This program is really focused on solutions-based approaches. So how do we remedy the complaints, not just collect them? That's no use to anyone, really. So all the paralegals are trained in domestic remediation mechanisms. So whether that's through the labour court or whether that's mediation or negotiation with employers, and that has been largely successful, including reinstating workers who have lost their jobs. So we are finding that those kind of more not so rigid, those avenues that are a bit more informal, and those mediation channels with factory owners has been a really kind of good initiative to essentially resolve some of those complaints. Thanks, Grace.
Thanks. And just building on that, I mean, you mentioned about factory owners. If I could maybe go over to Saqib, we have a question for you directly. So is there one or several independent unions in artistic milliners? If yes, how are they, beyond ILO, engaged prior to, during and after audits to provide complementary information?
Yeah, so I think I answered in the chat as well, but I'll answer it for everyone else. So what we do is, as we have discussed again and again, it's all about engagement. So internal engagement is also important. So we have set up committees as per law and beyond that as well, where we talk to the employees, because for us, a productive employee is a happy employee with no grievances. And of course, that's impossible for someone with no grievances, but lower level of grievances. So the earlier you engage them, you can identify what the problem is and solve them. Not only that, what we do is we run a comprehensive social awareness and training program in which we make them aware of what their rights are, right? Because we cannot expect them to read the books of laws and everything else. So it's our responsibility to make sure that they understand what their rights are as workers. We also engage with civil society who come in and talk to the workers. Sometimes anonymously, they engage the workers and try to find out what's going on. So it requires a lot of work from the HR side of things to ensure that workers are engaged and they are comfortable in sharing their stuff, because sometimes you have to understand that everything that you do will lead to a better environment in your organization, and that directly affects your productivity. So as soon as the manufacturers, they understand that happy workers will be productive and will help you improve your profitability, you will see more and more manufacturers engage in a different way with their workers. But yeah, this is how we do it, before audits, after, and during audit. We try to empower the workers with more information about their rights, but it can be through Panaflex, it can be through videos, it can be through mobile apps as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Saqib. We're running out of time, so I think we have to start looking at closing the session, but I thought we would end with a question which I think is really insightful for all of us, and I'll open that up to the whole panel, maybe starting with you, Jayanth, and followed by you, Laurent. So this question is, in order to reduce the cost and time spent on audits, could we work on a common framework for audits that could be accepted by all auditing third parties and run only one audit a year per factory? So a very practical question. And it'd be good to hear from you, Laurent, on the ETI, and perhaps there are some initiatives towards that. And also you, Jayanth, if as an investor, that would be something that would bring more comfort in terms of your investment decisions. Laurent,
yeah, go ahead.
Very quickly on this one, I think there are some initiatives that look at building some commonalities between audits, the SLCP and other initiatives that look at combining and looking at what are the similarities of audits. The reality in the ground, unfortunately, is that so many certification and so many expectation or framework are expecting different things from the audits, and make that work probably more difficult to be able to materialize itself. But I think the thinking itself is definitely the right thinking to have. Is probably will require quite a bit of work to get to a place where we are able to streamline audits more. But we absolutely understand the value of doing that and the load of audit on suppliers.
Great, thank you, Laurent. Jayanth, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think I respond to that question in the chat specifically. I think that would be the dream for a supplier and for the industry in general. But I think if I took a contrarian view And looked at it quite realistically, maybe that's not possible. I think there's always some standard certification that's fighting to be the, let's say, framework for all, and one ring to rule them all. But until that happens, I think, as Laurent was saying, you do see multi-stakeholder partnership programs kind of collaborating with each other, SLCP working on HIG and SLCP working on Fairware. So you do see that trend going in that direction. And there's probably one takeaway from Saqib's slide. I think that is the problem. Whether it could be one, not too sure, but at least fewer, let's say, frameworks, fewer kind of standards to go through, that would definitely help.
Great, thank you so much, Jayant. And if you perhaps could have some final reflections from Sarosh, Saqib, and Lara, maybe starting with Sarosh.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that, I don't think the brands at the moment, or the buyers are the ones who are not agreeing to this one single audit that does everything. And I think the bigger solution really is supply chain relationships, and to what extent buyers and suppliers can get into a partnership model, which means that buyers have to invest in sort of saying, I will work with you over a long period, and I will give you orders so that you can plan in advance and then build that trust. That's the key. This has worked in so many other industries, whether it is in automobiles, Toyota and its suppliers is like a family. So that is the key. And that's what will solve the problem. Auditing is a concept that is rooted in lack of trust. So that's the issue you have to solve.
And Lara, a few words from you.
Yes, Sarosh, I think those are very wise words to end on. And I think, auditing is widely seen as a plaster over more systemic issues. But whilst it's still in play, I do think we need to think about multi-dimensional, multifaceted approaches to identifying complaints that can kind of provide an extra lens over the audits that are going to continue being the kind of core source of information for brands. So yeah, hoping that we can kind of start to innovate a little bit about what that looks like with the community and the workers always central in mind.
And Saqib, you have the final word.
Yeah, and just add on to what Sarosh was saying, that trust deficit needs to be removed, and long-term supplier and buyer engagements are necessary. But we cannot always think of manufacturers as big suppliers. We also have to think of small and medium enterprises who do not have that kind of capacity where they can engage with brands for a longer period of time. They need to be taken care of as well in this context. And I would like to end with a quote that, the cost of being wrong is less than the cost of doing nothing. So it's always good to, continue to do something. And just, yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Well, thank you to all our speakers for their contributions, and to our participants as well for your engagement, your insightful questions and comments, and also to the team at Business and Human Rights Compliance for helping to organize this event. So just a little bit of housekeeping as we close, that everyone will receive a follow-up email with copies of today's presentations and also some background materials. And I know that a lot of your questions were not answered, so please do feel free to reach out and contact us, and we'll be happy to answer your questions or give you any guidance going forward. So thank you again to everyone. I hope you enjoyed the session. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye.